Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Disc Guidance segment with the 2MK team. Today we are showing off our new... Well, this bot covers a lot of spaces, honestly, so we can't really say which character exactly this is for. Hence the title of the stream, even though we tend to use something that will tell you the character anyway. In this case, it's mostly telling you that the characters almost all use fire, yeah, except Yashiro. So this bot is going to cover 5 different characters, technically 6, although one of them isn't so great for the purpose. And they all have different purposes, so we've got a lot to cover today. Let's get into it. Because of this, the stream will follow a slightly different standard, because there is 1, a lot of information, and 2, a lot of characters that need to be gone through and explained what usefulness you find and what doesn't work for certain ones. We're starting, of course, with Cronin, because Cronin is the relatively least useful of the bots in terms of pure effectiveness of teaching you things. However, if you do have a zoning style character, or one that might have some trouble getting in and tends to come in from the ground, or need to come in from the ground, you can certainly learn some things. While he is definitely not terribly well defended against aerial strikes, he does tend to make you jump in ways that cause you to have difficulty finishing your combos. So there's some consideration there. As always with our KOF bots, if you realize that it doesn't feel as if things are going well, it's just something to do with the randomness and the way that it flows off, so you probably should just try another round worth. We'll still be keeping up some of the standards of this, be explaining certain things about why the bots are designed the way they are, but that will be moved later into the stream because we really should start off talking about the core concept of this bot type as a whole, and some comparisons to the CPU, which we are not directly going to be making because they almost all, relatively speaking, kind of suck. The general thing that this bot that covers all these characters is trying to teach you is how to handle your own invincible options, whether that be an uppercut, an armored moves, which is not really invincible but can be very helpful, parry style abilities, and of course the roll, which can be done either forward or backward. The bots aren't even all the same in terms of how much meter you, the player, are allowed to have, but for most of them you can have your full, because as always with bots, your goal is to get points in the situation, and therefore you don't necessarily care how much damage you're doing to the opponent. The opposing bot, on the other hand, in all cases will start with maximum bar and simply not regenerate it as it goes. This is very frame data and punish understanding heavy, and a lot of what you're aiming to learn as a whole is based on that. Whether it be get out of the way and then punish, get closer when the situation seems to be disadvantaged and then punish, or, for various methods, punish before you're even in real danger because your opponent's moves can be armored or shifted around. Similarly, we'll be discussing the inputs a bit later, and probably changing at least one of them on stream toward the end of the stream. It's relatively easy to explain what the input that needs to be changed is, and it isn't one that needs to be changed for any specific change because of a bot. You're not changing it because you're choosing which bot you're going to be using. Most of the time you're choosing it simply because it suits what you're trying to do. There will definitely be certain bots that benefit more with specific ones, but this is the Action 5 input, which in most of our systems we specifically set to be the one that you should be expecting to change. So if you're familiar with our other bots from other games, you probably already know that you can change this up as you need to. Just of course be careful, as we still have not figured out exactly what causes KOF to lose a bot input and force you to do all of the inputs over again. However, one of the things we have so far sort of verified doesn't do that is changing to CPU mode, which we will do only for Cronin today. So let's change the action, the second thing, to CPU level 4 or 5. Usually level 4 is okay. But a lot of this tends to be... the CPU doesn't defend terribly well. And in this case, it partially makes bots even more useful in KOF than it is in some other games, because this relative lack of defense is only improved by having the CPU basically read your inputs. Basically, the flexibility and freedom that this game allows tend to make it so that the CPU is a little less helpful. However, if you find that you want to see what other moves the character can do, because obviously the bot's not going to be doing everything, we are cutting it down to just specific things, you definitely should take a look at it for any given character, or just to switch up to see if you can get your mental space to change, if you're the sort of person who needs to have that experience, to see it work differently and think about whether or not certain things you do are good or bad ideas in the first place, before you make any decision about whether or not the bot is actually helping. But as you can probably see, in a moment when we put Cronin back to stand, we should be able to just hit the bot start button and he'll go right back to doing bot things. So you don't necessarily have to worry about losing the bot inputs by swapping between the two of them. Now, as noted, Cronin isn't really the core concept here. We will get back to discussing why he's even in this group, when he's mostly just spamming specific moves and then doing his super. So let's switch up at least one character. We're going straight to K-, which is a little bit easier because he doesn't really do the same sorts of things. Here we go. All the way to the front, and you can immediately see the sort of things that are going to come up because he's such a mobile character. A lot of this is going to be me going into explaining why the inputs are the way they are, and how to make certain ones work a little better by changing character. But he does still kind of work. He's probably the, let's say, lowest quality of the options you've got available, but I don't want to say that specifically. It's more so that he's very volatile. Sometimes he's extremely dangerous, extremely good at doing things you want him to do, and other times he's like just spammy and doesn't do anything useful at all. But if you're focusing on getting your punishes and facing off with the sort of player who tries to keep themselves out of your space, he's decent because your goal can often be to hit your max range move or to try to grab him, and you still get some decent training out of that. Getting used to the idea that this character is basically never going to be where you want or expect him to be is pretty helpful. Still, there's a chance that we will not end up releasing this version as a whole bot page until we've done a little more work on the final input, the Action 5 previously mentioned, in order to give him some slightly more information. But you can check it out later on, therefore. Oh, now he's on. Sorta. So we'll give him one more chance before I go into discussing inputs themselves. The reason why this is so important is simply that when he is shown later in the stream where I change the input, you might have a bit of contrast to how he was working before to give you an idea of what changes did here. Whereas the other characters, it's a lot more obvious to tell what the change does. I figured it'd be useful to have some information on K-Dash in general. Your issue with him is going to be much more so your own targeting. If you defend too much, or if he forces you into defense, it's going to feel as if you're not really doing much of anything because he's relatively easy to hit in those situations. Just remember it as the sort of thing that you won't necessarily get away with, and we'll go from there. Alright then, moving on to the rest of this stream's segments. My notes are ready, the characters are ready, but while we normally go through the inputs themselves and explain them in total, now, before I do that, I have to go into the core of why they are the way they are, or it won't really make as much sense. And for that, I need to change to Kyo. Keys. Isla. Are these out of order compared to normal? Either way. Yeah, it definitely feels more like they're out of order. But this doesn't change, so weird. Again, the goal of this bot in general is to have you learn how to deal with specific things coming at you in offense. You're probably in a position where you have enough space to do the thing you need. This is not really a matter of helping you understand how to deal with pressure. Only things that look like pressure. So since all of this was built from Kyo as a start, the core was to get him to come forward and cause the repositioning part of the fight to be mostly done by the opposing character. A lot of it is combo practice as well, so you can think from that side. So even if the only thing you think you're going to get out of it is just practicing punish combos, it may still be worth your time to enter this one. As you can see, basically Kyo is just doing that all of the time. He will keep on coming at you, and this makes it relatively easy to defend if your goal is to block, but here that's not what we're doing. Our goal is to do things like that. And therefore, instead of spending your time thinking, well, I'm going to block and then see what he does, there are obviously times where that is the best idea, but you'll also be spending a lot of time thinking, how do I optimize my damage? How do I get into the correct position for these things? And that brings us to what's next most important, position. It comes up a lot against this bot. And basically all of the bots in this suite have the same problem. Problem in terms of what they're challenging you with, the player. Figure out how to get into the right position for your best punish without causing yourself to drop the punish entirely. For example, you see here, if I'm in the right position I get Geese's close heavy kick. If I just block, I can still get it, but I don't always. Especially if I like hold block for too long. I'll end up doing it the other way. And I'll get that. And of course, if I hold forward for too long, chances are I'll get a throw. So if you needed to train those moments of, am I doing this right? Under difficult situations, you'll have better luck that way. A perfect example. Similarly, you could get too caught up in it and have issues getting the correct thing regardless. And of course, finally, if he was in the air when you did it or went for a roll in specific situations, you get nothing. So it's there to help you understand the timing for these things can be very specific. Even down to whether or not he does the second kick of that hopping kick and it hits you. That is yet another thing that will decide for you whether or not you're getting success out of your punish. And for a relatively beginner bot, this is really important. Now, some characters have much less problems with this than others. But knowing how long you need to block, whether or not you needed to block to begin with, and what your opponent can do to you if you mess up, is super important. See? Invincibility, other problems come up really quickly. Similarly though, if Kyobot is doing certain moves, your goal will be to get through. Just to roll, that's it. But even once you've rolled through, you have to decide, is this the timing to go for that or something else? And if you're out of position, you will once again fail. So with all of that out of the way, let's look into what the inputs are and their relation to the different things that he's doing and the different things that you want done. Today I'm not necessarily re-inputting them. I may do that toward the end of the stream if there's time, but I'm going to try to keep it short, so since these are relatively simplistic inputs, we'll just go through them quite quickly. Unfortunately, once again, you will not be able to see the actual input on the screen unless I actually try to re-input it, but they will all be on the bot page as always. And I'm going to play them with their repeating form. I'm also going to leave Kyo at low meter for this first one because it helps explain it. I think I got enough health for this. This one is done by holding a heavy punch. It's often useful to hold a forward heavy punch, but we're still deciding exactly which one. You'll know when we give it out in full. Hold the heavy punch. Begin the recording so that it is on the first frame. Quarter circle forward light punch, all the while holding the heavy punch right to the end, and end the recording. It does not matter if you're holding the light punch at the end of the recording or not, like at all, I don't think. But you might want to try to make sure that you're not, because there is another space later where it might matter. It is the standard thing that once you are holding the heavy punch, he's never actually hitting the heavy punch again. So you get to see that heavy punch once, and if this is recorded correctly, he will never do the heavy punch version of this move. You'll be able to tell because of the sound he makes. If it doesn't sound like this, it's not working. If he's not continuing the string, it's probably not fast enough and therefore not working. But that's all there is to that one, and the next is similarly easy. This is quite literally just a down forward heavy kick, which you again hold right until the end the entire time. And from there, a quarter circle forward and end the recording. And that's, since you've held it, he will never hit the heavy kick again and will just wiggle forward repeatedly. The usefulness of this, as you might expect, is if you combine the two. Because once you've combined the two, you no longer have the guarantee that the kick will always be held or that the punch will always be held. And that starts to open up more options for moves. There's the sound we had before, and there's a different sound. The different sound is caused by the quarter circle forward from the second input playing into the heavy punch from the first input. And the result, as you see here, he'll do a lot of super. And also that move. It also allows him to use more chains out of the light punch, because he has a kick option somewhere in there now. And finally, if it does reach the point of him doing action 2 in the correct way to chain into action 1, he'll do the super, but depending on how many times action 1 replays, he'll charge the super. Which is not very meaningful in most play, but he will do it often enough that you will learn to pay some attention. As you can also see, of course, this is a bot that will absolutely crush you in terms of chip damage if you don't do something. But thanks to that perfect demonstration, I can move straight on to action 3, which is even easier to understand. There is not even an attack in here, I don't have to block. This is just a tap of forward, tap of back, tap of down. It's difficult to explain what the purpose of this input is other than wiggling around in neutral. And you should do your best to make sure that when it's done, mostly he'll wiggle forward rather than back. But this is quite literally a thing that will happen regardless. What will also you can see though is that depending on the timing, if you try to jump over his head, it may cause him to dash. Because just timing. And this matters a bit. This is, however, not something you should take out of this bot or consider to be useless, but it's, again, difficult to explain exactly why it's not useless. The purpose of it doesn't come up easily. We just know that it's deep bot theory as to why this must be in here, and it probably will not work if you remove it. It will, however, work if you don't time it terribly well, and you can try to re-record it as many times as you like. In fact, if you want to see a slightly different bot on any given day, just re-record this, and his rhythm will change very slightly, and you may get a better result, you may get a worse result, but you will certainly get a different result. And that will probably keep you on your toes a bit. His action 4 is a little harder to understand once again though. This move is basically a quarter circle back. In this case he's doing quarter circle back light kick, quarter circle back again. You don't hold the light kick, you don't really care about any of it, you're just doing this way because it's easy. The second quarter circle back is happening so quickly that it's technically happening while he's animating into the first. The result of this is that if we put him to use these two together, the one with the heavy kick and this one, sometimes he will use the heavy kick version, sometimes he will use a tap out of it, and sometimes he will use the light kick version. Meaning that you have to pay attention. The way that you punish this move and the way that you get pushed back by blocking it relies entirely on this. And while this would be relatively non-important, it is more important for other versions, other characters using the same thing. Depending on how you input this as well, you can go all the way to up very quickly because he's animating for so long that you don't have to worry about him jumping. If you wanted to work in a jump, the best place to put it is probably in his action 4. Because if he does the action 4 on normal timings, he will be going into the air already, using the move specifically, and then any jumps he does will be mostly absorbed by that animation, and he will jump very seldom. This also works basically fine for other characters, but we haven't had time to do every single test yet, and we'll have it on the bot page as an informational bit to explain which things don't seem to work or mess up other versions. And action 5, the one that we have said you can change, is actually more complex, but doesn't do a lot. You could similarly go here and get that same... Turned off something. Left on something. Here we go. You can tell I just know these because they look so suspicious. This one is basically forward plus light punch plus light kick, which you are again holding all the way to the end, and then just do a half circle back. It doesn't have to be a perfect half circle back either, but you'll know it's working because various things happen. Now, this one can also be done in another way, and the one you're seeing in the bot is actually that other way. We suggest you start with the half circle back one, but this that you're seeing in the bot is technically attempting to do a backwards uppercut motion. 4, 2, 1. Back, down, down, back. It does not matter if this does not work perfectly. If it works absolutely perfectly, then there's a very low chance of Kyo using his overhead sort of flip kick. But this is extremely rare because in order for this to work, because of how strict the inputs are in King of Fighters, the source of that kick, of that useful heavy kick that he would use to do the move, doesn't line up. When I say that, I mean that because it was a down forward heavy kick that you used, he's basically not going to do it. The few times he can do it, it's almost certainly going to be taken up by some other animation that he would have been doing for some other reason. So it is one of those ways to make it extremely rare. If you specifically want him to do this move, you will have to put in a kick yourself. But it's honestly not really a move that we are going to suggest you put in. It's not terribly helpful to learn to defend it from the bot's perspective because he's just going to spam it a lot of the time. and it would technically be better if he nearly never used it, which is the result we got. However, this constant capacity to roll also causes him to react certain ways if you roll past him at the exact moment required, which is a relatively large and important aspect of using these bots. But we will demonstrate a little bit later on what you might want to change it to and why you might want to change it. With those quote-unquote out of the way, therefore, let's turn everything on and talk about the purpose and point systems of it once again. The purpose, as demonstrated before, was do some punishes. Do them as best you can with punishes and so on. This is because Kyo is the simplest version of this bot, and that's the purpose. Overall, you just want to punish things. It does not matter if you play defensively at all. If you want to do something harder, or that is in any way intended to help you with your offense, you probably will want to change character. And we will definitely be showing off the best character for full challenge a little later on. But here we are simply going, how do I stop Kyo from hurting me without just blocking? And when I just block, how do I get the maximum punish out of it? Because he will do a fair amount of damage if you don't get this more or less right. So there's one point, and it's not easy to get because when he doesn't have meter, he's not going to use the move required. Roll through this and then punish it. You don't get the point for just rolling through it, so you do have to focus on how far am I, should I just try to hit him now, and so on. If you roll through at the last moment when he's very close to you, you might not be able to get a good punish, but it depends heavily on your character. And similarly, depending on what he cancels it out of, you might not notice in time to actually do the thing you're supposed to do. If you've got a character with armor, or parries, you might care about countering those sorts of things as well. But just spamming in neutral is usually going to get you hit because he will use both lows, highs, and specials. So me just going repeatedly, hey, let's do Geese's counter, doesn't even help against that because that's technically a projectile. And despite the long animation on this, even if I do this over and over and say, yes, here I am getting the point, there's a good chance I'm going to fail and die before I actually get enough points for it. As always, your aim is to count to 10. You might get lucky and get to 10, but you're literally just flipping a coin a lot. So either reacting extremely quickly, or recognizing the space you are at and saving yourself that way. For example, when I'm at full range, I'm not really afraid of Kyo doing much other than that low kick. So if I'm at the range where the low kick is a good idea, and only the low kick is a good idea, I can go ahead and use his low counter just as my way of dealing with the situation. As shown there, if Kyo charges it, you can still absolutely roll past him, but if you flinch or look for a different way because you're expecting to not get the punish, you'll end up in trouble. So it's a good way to teach yourself not to flinch, to just have a decisive reaction to something. And of course to teach yourself to not just spam counters if you have the character that can't do them. Getting yourself used to the fact that he might not have as much invincibility as you might expect is also helpful. And this happens for a lot of characters. We were also noting before that if he does things like an uppercut, or even the hop kicks in specific spaces, learning when to stop blocking so that you can get the maximum punish is important. Because if he does this uppercut from a lot of spacings, I can't actually get the full punish if I just hit the kick. See? I get a punish, but because he's not close enough, I can't do the follow-up. And this can therefore be a good way to help you understand ways that your character can reach or not reach. Some characters have lots of, let's call it range, on their close moves, related to something about their standing hurt boxes, and some characters have relatively poor setup there. He will also, of course, use his own invincible moves, often enough that you can't just power through everything he does. Another good demonstration of what happens there is the fact that if he does the kick, just the single one, the timing and the spacing for your punish are different, which is probably the only thing that makes this move particularly useful. He also has, as just shown, a guard point style move that will get him through certain things if you're even a little slow. That, for example, I didn't expect to work because I was attempting to demonstrate that you actually die when you do that, mainly because it's a projectile and Kyo himself doesn't necessarily enter your space quickly enough for you to take the win in that scenario, let's say. He's going well on the charges today. So you can see the little bits here. You can also do things like, if you wanted to get him to the other side of you, dash forward under the uppercut. But, moving from there then, we'll talk about specifically why other characters can do this just as easily, but only some of them. So our first switch will be to Billy Kane because he's not good at it. This is the one that we may not release without more modification, but we again will come back to this similar to how we will come back to K-Dash. If you fight from far away, and in this case Geese will be helpful for that, and I probably should use the double Reppuken instead. There are timings when he will just become really dangerous. But because we aren't confident in it and he tends to just get beat up when he's not actually playing a certain way, this may not be worth releasing as a whole. The main thing you're going to learn is how far away can I be from Billy and therefore he still kill me in some way. Which is honestly fairly far. Trying to approach him with a character that doesn't have terribly scary approaches is hard, but only if you've not gotten to a certain space on screen already. Once you've gotten far enough, even good Billy players have to start making some guesses. But as I said, we're going to come back to him because there's an input type that can make him much more effective, and he doesn't really need the role in the first place, as noted. So I'm just quickly showing off the fact that he doesn't seem to work terribly well as is. That's the wrong Yashiro. Yashiro, on the other hand, is somewhat helpful here. And that allows us to go into more discussion of specific point systems that aren't quite the same as the Kyo ones. Remembering again that Kyos were mostly block and punish this thing, roll and punish a different thing, make sure you get the maximum punish you can, and use your invincible moves to power or armor through things, which is a separate point to just blocking it. Yashiro is a little different, but not much. Particularly for Geese, it's often similar. But because of the way and speed he moves at, things change a lot. He's not being very movement heavy right now, but it often comes up. Because you are mostly guessing when it comes to Yashiro, he can attack from so far that you can't be sure whether or not you should in fact counter yet. And he crosses the screen so quickly that most people couldn't do it on reaction unless he was relatively far away and they were already expecting it. But the main thing you're caring about here is that if you poke at him enough, especially if you try to get some jumping attacks in, he'll eventually use that super meter to make your life very miserable in some other way. And those are the things, similar to Kyo, where you really want to have a counter ready. If you have a counter at all, or at least an invincible move ready. Because he has so much more range in general as a character without committing as hard, you similarly will find yourself trying to catch him or punish him from further away. In general, in fact, if Yashiro does his moves in total, you won't actually be able to do your close range punishes at all. But you don't get any points for doing them just because of that. You can interrupt him on his approach if you have extremely good timing, but this isn't really a plan you should be counting on in normal matches anyway. You can focus on the fact that once he does start a move, he becomes one of the most counterable characters in the game. Because he generally doesn't have too easy ways of stopping midway. Your problem is going to be that with that roll in there, it's going to be more difficult to decide whether or not he's actually posing a threat at the moment or just trying to get closer. Similarly, him starting to move is not a marker that you should do something immediately. You actually have a little bit of time, and because you have a little bit of time, it's a little bit easier to get yourself caught up in things. So if you've found yourself learning to just counter Kyo as soon as is possible, or to use your invincible move to get through it, you can help yourself to slow down by fighting Yashiro, if for some reason that's important to you. Just go with whichever thing helps you with most opponents, or based on your own character. If you need to be able to deal with situations immediately, just the moment you see some movement, hit a button to solve the problem. Then Kyo is your best bet. And if you feel like you might need to delay a little bit for some reason, you generally are better off training with Yashiro, but the inputs are the same. We were originally going to give some information about neutral jumping, but that really matters more for a different setup and a different bot. One thing you will end up understanding is quite a bit about the ranges from which you can do this. And it will help you learn to do certain punishes from further away. Regardless of whether or not you think it's a good idea to do them in standard matches, it's good to know them and still be able to push them out if you need to. He's also a good bot to learn certain Shatter Strike things from, simply because he has multiple hits, and getting used to the idea that you can use the Shatter Strike to get through them, or get your Shatter Strike combos going, can help a lot. He also has very long, as we call them, super flashes, which will help you recognize and understand whether or not your inputs are being, as people say, eaten by the game. Your opponent chose to do something and you had to delay your own input, even though their move is going to start in basically just one moment. You end up with a very, very small frame window to complete your own input. And even though it's just something as simple as quarter circle forward, blow back button, it's really important, because if you attempt to do anything this crazy, not necessarily a good idea against Yashiro specifically, but there are characters where it's a good idea to do it, and it's probably better to do the bot training on a bot where if you got it wrong because you were too slow, you're not disadvantaged by it. Also training. But as we're already quite far into this, and I do have 2 more things to show off explicitly, let's go to the star of the show, the bot that made this all work the best, basically. While going through and testing which characters worked well with this, we got to the point of testing Mai Shiranui because she's Mai, why not? And it turned out that she basically does this the best, because of the interactions between her moves and the rhythm that is set here. Mai is the one you use when you've reached the point of actually intending to make some offense out of this, and are no longer worried about things like the perfect spacing for your punish. You'll end up swapping out, therefore. She has the ability to just basically zone you, and once you're certain that you understand your spacing, and this is easy, you no longer specifically need to be stressing yourself out that way. But Mai is confusing as a character. She has a move that basically looks like the beginning of her roll, and even without any jump, which you could easily add, she also has moves that avoid lows, specifically the main one you're seeing now. She's entirely capable of throwing both forms of her fan, the slow and the fast, and things like that. Also, of the bots, at the general input we have, she blocks approximately the best for rhythm reasons. So it works out really well when you're trying to learn some form of offense to have a bot that will manage this part. But the real thing you're trying to work on when it comes to her is, can you do your hop offense? She moves so much and in so many ways that targeting the hop to begin with is difficult for beginners and probably up to about mid-level. Can you even do the hop input itself in the amount of time she allows for you? If she happens to move in that space of time, you're probably going to miss anyway. And knowing which button will be effective can be really difficult. We specifically suggest using the blowback button for characters for whom that's even remotely a good idea, simply because it's the easiest way to get proper practice. Geese is not necessarily that type of character though, so... I think I'm supposed to hit hop heavy. This one might be harder to manage because if you're actually doing this quite fully, you won't necessarily recognize whether or not you've done a hop or not until afterwards, depending on your character in particular. But after a while of practicing it, you will probably be confident that you did or did not hop, and if you were doing it with proper offense, you'll know because you'll generally hit her if you hop properly and you won't hit her if otherwise. This is supposed to always be a forward hop. But until you're practiced enough, you can't be absolutely sure that you will get everything right while still focused on everything else. Similarly, you should, at least some of the time, roll to avoid her attacks. But unlike Kyo, where it's just, okay, Kyo's doing this slow thing that I think he's going to do, I'm just going to roll past him, here you're doing something much harder in most cases. You don't really want to roll past fans being thrown at you most of the time. Technically, you want to hop those, and it's not always a good idea to do that because of the spacing you end up at. Sometimes you actually want to just jump them, which is kind of counterintuitive because you get no point for that. But, most importantly, once you are in the middle of the screen, there are times when Mai does a thing and what you want to do is to roll backward, which can be really hard to get used to because there are seldom situations where your opponent is coming at you and your response should be, I'm going to roll away. If you roll too early, let's say, because you see her roll and think that it's the move, you'll usually get hit by something. But it is really not that simple to just roll at the last moment, and you'll probably get guard cancelled if you're wrong. But that is the correct thing. This is relatively difficult to do if Mai is close to you, but not difficult enough that you could say you can't pull this off. Similarly, if you roll too early in the other case, you just get hit by the move anyway. And you shouldn't, and really can't, roll the super. Not even the guard cancel will usually help. So you've upgraded to a character where technically you should be on offense, but when you happen to not be, your goal needs to be to get away from her because she has done a move. This does not teach you anything about Mai's other abilities, basically the dropping in on your head or similar, but defending this is not specifically hard, it's a matter of understanding what your opponent's mindset and plan was. Similarly, if you do guard cancel her advance correctly, instead of being in her... what's the best way to put that? When Mai does this move, if she's at the right spacing, she will be more or less advantaged, and you, being the defender, may or may not know how much that is. If you do manage to either guard cancel or roll the move correctly, the problem goes away somewhat. But we are not necessarily suggesting that you actually do this in every situation. It has a lot more to do with where you are on the screen, as always. If she's particularly close to you, there's no need to roll. If she's at around that spacing, if you roll incorrectly you get hit, but at least you only get hit a little bit. But as a whole, fighting her off, doing the main things you're supposed to do, it's not terribly difficult. She is, however, the same style of bot as our usual. the better you get at doing it, the more dangerous she becomes in turn. So you will normally get much more of a challenge out of this than fighting Kyo. You can of course still armor through her things, and you can roll through some other things in specific ways that will help you, but because she tends to be crossing the screen, rolling at the wrong timing, particularly if you roll forward, will result in you not getting any punish. And in fact, often this just gives Mai more of a advantage than you probably want her to have. That one can be rolled at close range because she moves even further, but you still don't get any punish. If Mai is relatively far away from you when she starts this move, that's when you mostly want to roll it. But again, these moves are generally punishable without you doing anything additional, so you don't actually have to guard cancel at all. In fact, guard cancelling when you aren't needing to is just a quick way to lose meter. And even though you do start this with full meter, you can definitely get quite a bit more out of this by changing your own meter to be lower for fighting Mai specifically. But therefore, before we go on for too much longer, we have covered all the characters, and therefore I will try to quickly put in the last change, let's say. And this can be also a reference for those of you who have watched all of this and just went, I don't even know what you're talking about, how do I record bots in the first place? You will set your recording slot, in this case we are setting slot 5. Depending on what controller you're using, we assume PS4 or PS5 and not arcade stick, but it works for them too, just figure out what your best button is. Set your recording button to something, whatever is probably easiest to hit without thinking about it, while still doing all the things you normally do to hit other buttons. Your repeat can be set to touchpad or R3 or whatever. And at that point, just make sure that you are on the slot you intended in this recording slot. If you are playing with the bot, usually you want to set this off just to make sure absolutely that nothing happens to it. But we are recording slot 5 here. Once you are recording, let's say I wanted to have her do something with a backwards heavy kick or forwards heavy kick. Mai is standing on the left side of the screen right now, so her forward direction, if I hold it, causes Geese to walk in that direction, which is back for Geese, but you should be thinking about what Mai would be doing. If I hit the heavy kick, then Geese just does the heavy kick, and you can see on the left side of the screen, it's basically going, you are holding this direction plus this heavy kick, and here's a very long time that you're holding it. If I tap that record start button and then release it and then tap it again, it says 27 frames of nothing. All of that is a way of telling me now that if I were to try to replay this, which in this case I can do by pressing the touchpad, and one additional note while we're here is that once you do a recording, no matter what others you had activated, you will only see that recording. As soon as you've done one, it will drop you back in here, and if you press repeat, this is all you'll get. So from Mai's perspective, she is holding heavy kick and forward. Because she's holding the heavy kick, she's not going to actually ever hit heavy kick. You're never going to see the move again unless I stop and restart. In which case I could get either a throw, that, or her close heavy kick if I was not standing quite close enough to be thrown. So with all that aside, let's just look at what Mai's moves are. This move is easy and is just a quarter circle forward plus kick. We know that she has a quarter circle forward from various places, and we know that she has multiple kick inputs available to cause her to do it. Her quarter circle back and kick does nothing. Her quarter circle back and punch does something. But technically, because of the way that her moves animate, despite the fact that we should, strictly speaking, have a quarter circle back punch input, she doesn't do it. And that was one of the things we were discussing right at the beginning of the stream. The very first input, whether or not you are holding forward when you are holding that heavy punch, is the main thing that determines whether or not Mai is doing this move. So if you don't want her to do this, make sure you are holding forward. If you do want her to do it, make sure that you are not holding forward in action 1. But this move isn't terribly important in our perception of how the game works for her, so we didn't put it in. You can easily change it, and it has nothing to do with input recording 5. Kyo will not suffer if you do this one way or the other because he doesn't care. And neither will Yashiro. So of the 3 that we know work really well, you can change this at will depending on what you want Mai to do. And therefore, we don't really need to quote-unquote waste an input on this. But just to demonstrate that briefly, once again, holding heavy punch, tap it, release it, tap it again, and now, since I must go in and check this one more time, the quarter circle back should be this one. No, wrong one. Here we are. Noting as before, her quarter circle back and kick doesn't do anything. And that's me having the exact experience that I was discussing before. Did I turn on both? I did. No, wrong one again. In general though, if you are looking for a way to get her to do specific moves, you can change this one more often than anything else. So let's add what needs to be added, let's say. If we wanted her to, for example, jump to get this well-known and relatively popular move, it's the same thing. You can in fact hold up this whole time and then do this to see what you get. And when replayed, you'll get my hops. But before we were discussing whether or not you could get the uppercut style motion in and still get everything you wanted. Most importantly, remember that when you change action 5, you have removed the bot's tendency to forward roll. And depending on what you actually want to happen, you might want to try to keep it. But if you keep the forward roll because it overrides so many other inputs, you should be expecting to not see specific things. And this can be bad or good depending on what you want the characters to do. Similarly, if you wanted her blowback attack, then the same thing. Hold this, tap, tap again, and she'll just use blowback and then walk, because that was the easiest way to do that possible. You just hold it the whole time. Let's use just these two. But you'll notice now that she has the Shadow Strike, because there is in fact a quarter circle forward in here that she can use to get it. At the beginning of the stream we mentioned a half circle back option. And this half circle back doesn't need to be with anything in particular. This is the thing we were suggesting everyone input, more or less. So I'm finally going to just record that. This is the only change I'm actually making. I will put in the same forward light punch plus light kick. I will hold it the entire time still, and I will do a half circle back. This can be a little bit difficult in certain cases, because if you end up rolling forward too much, it will cause button shifts, so it's best to do it this way. Holding them, tap, quarter circle, or half circle, and see what you get. If you've gotten it right, it can be hard to tell, because again, she won't actually do anything if you replay it. She'll do that and then do this once. So you can't be absolutely sure that she reached back, except that on the left side of the screen now you can see where it probably stopped. It's a little bit difficult to make out, but if you are technical enough about these inputs, you probably can see it already. There is 150 frames of me holding the current walking direction, plus light punch plus light kick. Then 21 frames that are empty, because it's not showing any of the things from when I was playing as Mai. It just records 21 empty frames for Geese's inputs. And we see from the end of this that when that ended, I was at down back light punch plus light kick. And that is not as easy to use as certain others, but it can be helpful in specific things like this one. So we know that we must record it again. What you would want is for me to be doing this and end up with the new thing that shows at the end of this being just back. So that was probably right. Or maybe I missed some in-betweens, and it still won't work properly. Maya is unfortunately not the best or easiest character to test this with. I'm just demonstrating how it will change her quickly before we go on to anything else. Member selection. No. Quick select today, as always. No, I don't need to show off that. So as demonstrated at the beginning, K doesn't necessarily work that well in the form we had before, which was basically a backwards uppercut, which does some things but not easily understood things. So now we've gone to the standard input, the half circle back, and if that's correct at all, when I start to play other things along with it, we should see a different result. Turn that off. Of course, he's still just going to do that a lot, but his timing has changed, first of all. And with any luck, he'll probably do something more useful in a moment. You were just gonna uppercut, weren't you? There we go. You'll notice that he doesn't actually roll all that much. But when he does roll, it's probably absorbing the rest of that. Fortunately, as mentioned, these characters don't really have moves that matter a lot for the purpose. What we're trying to get them to change is the rhythm of certain things. And similarly, if you're not familiar with Kyo, there's a reason to do this because it will give him one additional move, assuming it's working. If I did the recording correctly, then changing to Kyo would in fact shift it. But because this move is relatively easy to understand, assuming again that he even has it, it's not necessarily something we thought was important for him to have in the bot. Because KOF's inputs are relatively stricter, you won't necessarily see it because I could just easily have gotten it wrong, but those of you who are familiar with this character know that Kyo has a basically half circle back grab style move. And if I just record it standardly, we'll get that at basically any time, and it shouldn't matter. So in this case, I'm literally just going to record a half circle back with no roll at the beginning of it. And no button at the end of it either. This is important because of what it causes to happen later. You can use these sorts of things to get all sorts of strange effects because of the way that KOF moves in general work. But as noted, even if it was correct, this down forward heavy kick is not going to be enough to grant anything useful because of the strictness of the inputs as a generality. And this does nothing, as noted before. You could put something in it if you wanted to, but it's not usually a good idea because he will wiggle in the wrong way. But notice that we'll now get a dash. Let's go all the way then and record this as a heavy kick, usually a back heavy kick, and then a half circle back, which can be a little bit difficult, but not always. Did I end up at back there? Looks like I did. Oh, I ended up at back up. Wonderful. This sort of input is usually the hardest to do because you also have to make sure not to hold it, as demonstrated there. With this move available, you will probably see something slightly different happen. And for the sake of it, we'll do that just in case I hit the wrong thing. It will still be rare. Not very rare, but it will take the place of the roll because of the way we've input the other things. it'll be rare enough to be a problem for people who don't recognize it, but overall, since you tend to be fighting so defensively, this isn't recommended for a KO edition. It only changes Cronin's flow very slightly as well. Because as you can see, he doesn't necessarily have any moves that help with it either, but his rhythm changes. He's more so the character where we again suggest figure out what is the best thing for him as a whole, or the thing that most counters your own style, and change it to that. The half circle back, on the other hand, has a very interesting effect when you jump over your opponent at the correct times. I think this does work on Cronin, but I'm probably quite far over time for this stream already, and therefore don't plan to spend a lot of time trying to show it off. At least not for him. Testing bots in this way generally ends up being at least a little bit complicated simply because you can't actually be sure if one of the complex things you were trying to put together is working or not, other than to fight them for a while and hope for the best. But in Billy's case it's basically the same. It changes his rhythm, but not really his moveset. The main important reason for being so aware of being able to put that there or do other things is because there are characters where this bot could almost work, but they're lacking a core component of their offense or defense that is in fact handled purely by some quarter circle or half circle back input that you want to put there. So throw that in if you want to try this with others. What we're really demonstrating is that it doesn't really make enough difference to most of the others. Mai, Kyo, all of these characters will basically ignore whether or not you've put that in as the uppercut or the half circle or similar things. We therefore suggest putting in the half circle because characters who do have half circle moves but otherwise suit this option in some way are much more effective once they've got it. Just go straight. And most of them will work just the same or just as well if it is forward, light punch, plus light kick, half circle back. Nothing in particular. The ones who need a heavy kick move should be done differently so that you can get the heavy kick at all. But those who only need a light kick, you might not even be able to get that done either because of specifics of the way the game flows and the fact that if you hold the light kick the entire time, they'll just ignore you. Understanding this from the bot theory perspective was not really something we wanted to go into too heavily in this bot as a whole, but given that King of Fighters bots aren't likely to be too complicated, this seems like the best place to do it, simply because this stream would be the one most able to be referenced for most people, and it's also likely to be the bot that most people start off with. If you're going to learn anything about inputting these or choosing things about them later for your own purposes, it's probably better that you have this information from here. So yes, the final point to note. The reason you put in the half circle back is in the few cases where this will result in you getting a punch move that you want. Usually a heavy punch move. If you specifically needed something else, then you can still get it by simply not holding the light punch and light kick the entire time. And that will give you at least a light kick option. And so on. Feel free to experiment, in other words. Standing heavy punch. That was slow. Fast but didn't end it. And didn't hit the light punch in time. As you can see, this is the sort of thing that you really only want to have to do once, so we're very thankful that KOF actually saves at least one bot. That looks suspicious. She has no quarter circle forward move, so this is functionally correct. Looks wrong. Probably right. Kinda long though. Better. But that basically covers it all. And that long ramble at the end is just a primer for anything you will find on the bot pages that is going to be very confusing because of the sheer amount of information that this particular bot, which is really more like 5 bots in one, requires for you to get anywhere in terms of using it. The bot itself will be released on our website 2-mk.org at around 7:30 Eastern Time on Sunday, probably just before our DNF duel content. Whether or not you get 3, 4, or 5 bots is mostly going to depend on the amount of time we have to put in for both testing and development, because even though this is a disc guidance stream and is meant to give you as much information as we can manage, it would be slightly wasteful to spend a whole week delaying it even longer when we are so reasonably confident as is. So there may still be a few changes of some type that you might want to make a note of, but we promise not to change anything so heavily that this specific stream, and therefore the YouTube content that is related to it, becomes useless altogether. You can keep track of our Twitter to _MK_FGC for any information on delays in the bot or just when it goes up. We don't expect to have any specific Saturday content. It's more of a toss-up as to whether or not we'll be having our Dead or Alive 60 times Battle Lounge. It's more unlikely than likely. So you can join us on Sunday for DNF Duel, and look out for the bot release on that date as well. On Monday we will have our Mishmashing Battle Lounge in Street Fighter V. We're unlikely to have the Tuesday melt as of last check, and Wednesday night in Birth is 50-50 at this point, but you will be seeing us next week for another Feeling Thursday King of Fighters Battle Lounge. And there's a decent chance you will even get another bot next week, as we will probably have finished the work we were doing on Angel by then. So look out for that. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with me and good night everyone.